Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at CSEC today. My name is Soogi Park. I'm a research scholar here at CSEC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our seminar today. It is an especially timely moment to be discussing nuclear thresholds, escalation dynamics, and the future of nuclear restraint. Around the world, we're seeing renewed investments in low-yield nuclear options. We're seeing ongoing crises in Europe and the Middle East, and intensifying debates about deterrence credibility and non-use norms. And today's speaker sits right at the center of those debates. It's our delight to host Professor Lisa Langdon Koch. She's an associate professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. Many of you might know her by her famous book, Nuclear Decisions, which received the Robert Jervis Best International Security Book Award. Her work, and especially the talk today, bridges political psychology, public opinion, and nuclear strategy. She's bringing some empirical methods to questions that have traditionally relied on assumptions. So today, she will be presenting experimental evidence gathered across 4 nuclear relevant states, India, Pakistan, United States, and United Kingdom, to examine how citizens think about the low-yield nuclear weapons during escalations. So she's going to be talking for about 45 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor for Q&A. For those who are joining us online, if you use the Q&A functions, we'll try to get to you after the talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lisa Koch.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And can everybody hear me? All right, great. It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be able to present some of the work that's coming out of a project that Matt Wells and I started. The Stanton Foundation generously funded us. And then as Matt transitioned out of academia, we brought Kristyn Karl on as co-author. And so now Kristyn and I are shepherding papers coming out of this broader project that involves these 4 different countries, all in pursuit of investigating the role of low-yield nuclear weapons in crisis dynamics. So in this talk, I'll start by introducing this topic. I'll talk in more detail about how we see the role of low-yield nuclear weapons in crisis dynamics. I'll present the research design, and then I will focus on exploring what we learned from citizens in India and Pakistan. I'll present a little bit on the United States and United Kingdom, where we had a Russia-NATO scenario to present. And this was in early 2023. And then I'll offer some concluding thoughts. So this image will get us started. This is from a 1958 war game hosted at the US Naval War College. And I'm starting with this image because in multiple wargaming exercises in 2016, many Obama administration officials favored a low-yield nuclear strike in response to a hypothetical Russian low-yield nuclear attack. Fred Kaplan reported this in his 2020 book, The Bomb. And what he reported about this was that the officials in the administration, either the deputies or the principals who were conducting separate war games, the officials who favored a low-yield nuclear response made this choice despite the prospect of escalation and retaliation from Russia, despite the fact that they lacked an obvious target. Several officials knew that they wanted to conduct a tit-for-tat response, but it wasn't clear where they should conduct it. Despite normative beliefs that the use of nuclear weapons is morally wrong, and despite the expectation of the international condemnation that would follow. And as we all know, the possibility of this hypothetical war game from 10 years ago becoming a reality has only increased since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine and the fall 2022 scare that Vladimir Putin was strongly considering the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. So first, I want to talk about what I mean by low-yield nuclear weapons. There's no standard definition, but scholars and analysts converge around the idea that low-yield nuclear weapons mean nuclear weapons that have an explosive yield of about 10 kilotons or less. Some people say 7 or 8 kilotons or less. But we can put that into context by thinking about little boy the bomb used to attack Hiroshima in 1945, as having an explosive yield of approximately 15 kilotons. So what makes a low-yield nuclear weapon different is largely a matter of perception. You could draw the line at different points, but perception is what matters ultimately in a crisis in terms of how leaders will respond. So we have different ways of talking about low-yield nuclear weapons. Some people refer to them as tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, and this is most often how I observe it, this being talked about in media reports. Jim Mattis is not alone, but this quote is one of my favorite quotes. He said in 2018 before the House Armed Services Committee, "I don't think there's any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any nuclear weapon used at any time is a strategic game changer." And I've heard other US officials say essentially the same thing. So the words tactical and battlefield are not terrifically helpful to us because a low yield explosive nuclear weapon could be delivered by strategic means or non-strategic means. And it carries these connotations of limitation, confinement to a battlefield environment. We could think of them as non-strategic and use a more legal term, meaning weapons excluded from arms control treaties, but that's a little hard to get to convey meaning through that term to a broader audience. And so both scholars and practitioners seem right now to prefer the terms lower yield or low yield, both relative terms, to describe these weapons. And the reason this is important today is not just because of the possible Russian use case from 2022, but also because in the last 15 years, we've seen an uptick in cross-national interest in developing arsenals that contain more low-yield nuclear weapons than in the past. That includes the United States, that includes Russia, Pakistan, even the United Kingdom recently, and possibly China. Why so much interest? The answer is largely grounded in core deterrence mechanisms, which I'm going to talk about. So in the mid-1960s, US defense officials and theorists introduced the term fire break to refer to the conceptual barrier between conventional and nuclear weapons use at a tactical battlefield level. And so for those of us who live in California, we are intimately familiar with the idea of a fire break. So here, this actually is a picture from the Georgia National Guard, but here we have a bulldozer that is digging out vegetation to create a break where a wildfire could not jump over the dirt in between because it would have nothing to latch onto. And that would contain the spread of the wildfire. So the conventional nuclear fire break should contain conflicts to conventional weapons use. The difference between keeping your fight conventional or breaking the nuclear taboo, that should contain conflicts to conventional weapons use and prevent escalation over the fire break. Bernard Brodie argued during this time period that if conventional conflict escalates, it would be belief in the fire break that would prevent the breach of the fire break. So again, perception comes into this. I believe the fire break will hold and that nobody would be so foolish as to actually cross it. But Herman Kahn in this same period argued that technological developments that could one day emerge, that in developments in what he called very small nuclear weapons, we might call them low-yield nuclear weapons, may blur the distinction, so sanctified by convention, so ratified by emotion, so easily defined and understood between conventional and nuclear weapons. And so might we be nearing a situation like that today? That's what I am ultimately trying to investigate. So two recent technological revolutions make this a particularly timely issue. We have an accuracy revolution in guidance systems, and Scott and Alan have written about this along with others. An example of this is the US B-6112 nuclear bomb. It is a guided gravity bomb. It is the first of its kind. It has a new tail kit assembly with a guidance system that increases the level of accuracy of delivery substantially. And it provides standoff capability, meaning it can be launched at a safe distance from the adversary's reach. And this allows then, because of that precision and because of that standoff capability, this allows for lower yield nuclear weapons because you can be so precise in your targeting that you don't need the larger yields to obtain the deterrent outcome that you want. These revolutions have generated competing predictions about the likelihood of future nuclear weapons use. So why is that? The argument and debate is whether this is stabilizing or destabilizing in terms of a crisis environment. And the reason where you fall on that debate depends in part about how you think about core nuclear non-use mechanisms or deterrent mechanisms. So at the heart of deterrence, as we all know, is that it is the threat of unacceptably costly punishment married with some credibility of that threat that should deter your enemy from doing the thing you don't want them to do. Those words, costly and credibility, are core mechanisms. How costly the punishment is, the more costly it is, the more unbearable it would be, the greater the deterrent should be. But there's a paradox. The more costly it becomes, the less credible the threat is that you would actually use it, especially if your adversary can retaliate in kind. And so we have ways to understand how we could get to credibility, even with costs that seem too high to be rational, such as the threat that leaves something to chance, as we all know from Thomas Schelling, the risk of accident, the risk of miscalculation, a mistake. These are all those threats that hover in the shadows, that where we say, okay, maybe it's not credible that someone's intentionally going to do this, but it could happen by accident. The threat leaves something to chance. But what if we lowered the cost? Wouldn't the cost and the credibility then trade off? If I had an option for the cost to be very bad, but not seemingly perceived to be irrational, then the credibility goes up. A rational person might actually be able to use it. And again, this is going to be a perception story. How small is small enough when it comes to cost? I don't know. Is there any such thing as small enough? Small enough if we are talking about nuclear use and crossing the fire break? I don't know. But for sure, chance becomes less important because credibility increases. The other core mechanism to think about is the nuclear taboo. And Tannenwald argues that the taboo is grounded in revulsion, that the effects of nuclear weapons are so horrific and so gruesome that we feel a sense of revulsion even contemplating their use. If low yield or lower yield nuclear weapons might be able to be used and have a more confined effect on human beings and the environment, that sense of revulsion might be at least mitigated, if not eliminated. And so I argue that low yield nuclear weapons, to some extent, should alter each of these mechanisms. So let me now preview the India and Pakistan element of this study, and I'll talk through just a couple of recent events in this rivalry, and then talk about how I'm the research design of the study. And I realize as I talk about this that I'm sitting in a room filled with South Asia specialists who know much more about this than I do. So I'm going to look to them for any specifics that I can't answer in the Q&A. But so here we go. So what makes the India-Pakistan rivalry, in my mind, especially important to study when we think about how low-yield nuclear weapons affect crisis dynamics? So in February and March of 2019, we marked the first time that a nuclear-armed state had ever used air power to attack a nuclear-armed enemy's sovereign territory. That was the Pulwama and Balakot crisis between India and Pakistan. In 2025, not even a year ago, we had the 4 days in May crisis. It was precipitated by a terrorist attack 2 weeks prior on Indian civilians who were vacationing essentially in Indian Kashmir. After I don't want to say that this is conclusively causal, but after a great deal of public pressure on Modi to respond, there was an escalating series of strikes between India and Pakistan, and that involves strikes within each state's sovereign territory, and India again breaking another precedent and going much farther into Pakistan's national territory than it had prior. In both of these crises, leaders issued veiled nuclear threats, statements that raised the stakes. Both citizenries find any crisis regarding Kashmir to be highly salient. The disputed territory is of vital interest in both nations. So this was already a matter of high salience to both Indians and Pakistanis, but especially any time a flare-up in this rivalry occurs over that territory, citizens are paying attention. And this was facilitated by social media posts, sometimes containing disinformation, sometimes being misrepresented, that stoked public outrage. One lesson that Pakistan took away from the 2019 crisis was that their strategy, which they announced in 2011, of full spectrum deterrence was working. Pakistan's full spectrum deterrent strategy is to invest in a diverse array of nuclear weapons. Don't focus on the higher yield weapons. Focus instead on the lower yield part of the arsenal. And do that to convince India that Pakistan's nuclear deterrent is credible, that Pakistan, Sitara is laughing, so this must be, I've read your work, Sitara, so we're speaking the same language here, that the deterrent is credible, and that in the words of Pakistani Brigadier Imran Hassan of the SPD, that it plugs the gaps, meaning nobody believed that we would try to destroy India's cities because that would destroy Pakistan as well. If we have the lower yield nuclear weapons, it gives us a credible option. And the Strategic Plans Division, the SPD, officials have cited full spectrum deterrence as the reason the 2019 crisis did not escalate further. So they see that as the proof is in the pudding that this is working. Pakistan, of course, being the weaker conventional power. India's response, it has been suggested, might be a move toward preemptive counterforce options. If India feels that that's the best approach to this credible Pakistani nuclear threat, what if India began seriously contemplating, and some scholars suggest that it has, a strike against those capabilities in the first place? So again, this is raising the stakes based on these changing perceptions. So are low yield nuclear weapons stabilizing or destabilizing? They could be stabilizing because the threat is credible, and so we get stability at the deterrence level, perhaps at the strategic level. It could be, and perhaps at the tactical level. It could be destabilizing because the weapons would lower the threshold for acceptable nuclear weapons use. And really, these are two sides of the same coin. The more credible the threat, it means I could now get greater stability, but it's because I'm raising the risk that I could actually use them. So how did we seek to investigate this question in terms of how people are thinking about this today and what that might reveal to us about what a future crisis could potentially look like? We used survey experiments, which have utility for investigating these kinds of questions for several reasons. One, it's very hard to get information about exactly how leaders and officials are thinking about these things in a crisis because that's secret. So you have to find additional routes in. And what's helpful about survey experiments is that you can manipulate different conditions so that you can investigate different conflict conditions to conduct direct tests and consider counterfactuals. And Scott and Ben Valentino and Daryl Press got this rich field started in terms of nuclear use in 2013 with their seminal article. They're useful because publics may shape leaders' beliefs about political costs. And we have a lot of different, we have a lot of argument in this literature about whether public attitudes toward nuclear use would affect leaders' decision-making or not, because ultimately leaders are not taking a poll and deciding whether to take that step forward or not. But if the public will impose political costs on your regime or won't, or could celebrate your decision, then the public might either constrain a leader or goad a leader toward or away from or toward nuclear use. And finally, it's possible that publics may not be all that different from elites, at least under certain conditions. Do publics know the ins and outs of deterrence theory? Generally, no. However, there is some evidence indicating that when a conflict is highly salient, public responses to scenarios are similar to elite responses in several ways. So this is an avenue for future research that I think is really potentially very interesting. And I will offer maybe a couple of insights toward that, but that's not my focus here. This is my focus. Here are the key questions that we are asking. And again, I just want to highlight the rich literature that we are responding to and hoping to be a part of through this study. And the many people right now, this is a really dynamic research area in terms of the use of survey experimentation to gain purchase on these kinds of questions of nuclear use. So first, we are asking, do citizens exhibit restraint regarding nuclear use in a low-yield nuclear environment? Are they more likely to retaliate with conventional bombs than low-yield nuclear weapons? And are they more likely to choose low-yield nuclear weapons over higher-yield nuclear weapons? How do people understand these choices and how are they thinking about them? What happens if the fire break is breached? If the enemy country uses low-yield nuclear weapons first, do citizens want the tit-for-tat response? Are they looking for an in-kind response? Will citizens be more restrained if they're primed with information that the effects of nuclear weapons use are materially different from conventional bombing? So this gets into not the cost aspect, but the normative aspect. If the taboo is grounded in revulsion, if you're primed with information that highlights what the gruesome effects would be, does that prompt nuclear restraint or not? And how do feelings about the rival state or beliefs about retribution and punishment affect restraint? And here I'm drawing on a rich literature investigating the associations between these feelings or beliefs and your desire to use nuclear weapons against an enemy or not to. So we investigated these questions using survey experiment scenarios. The hypothetical scenario we provided in India and Pakistan concerned an Indian attack against Pakistan's military base in Kashmir, or a Pakistani attack against India's military base in Kashmir, depending on which national citizenry we were talking to. The hypothetical scenario for the US and UK companion study was a Russian strike against a NATO airbase in the Baltics. Respondents were assigned to one of two initial strike types at random. So the enemy's initial strike was either conventional or low yield. And respondents received information about the number of military and civilian casualties, with deaths being held constant across the two conditions. So we chose our targets carefully, and under real-world conditions, we chose rural military bases, essentially, where either a very heavy conventional attack or a very low yield nuclear attack could be expected to yield similar death counts. That way, that allows us to isolate whether it is nuclear that is making a difference in people's preferences for retaliation. When we fielded the surveys in the US and UK, we used YouGov to field internet surveys in English, 2,500 US citizens, 2,500 UK citizens. In Pakistan, we employed the local firm Gallup Pakistan. They conducted interviews face-to-face throughout the country in Urdu. They ran a pilot for us first of 53 Pakistani citizens, which I'm very grateful for their willingness to do that and make sure that people understood the scenario and understood low yield nuclear weapons. I'll talk about that in a minute, how we know that people understood what we were talking about. And ultimately conducted a study with 2,000 citizens. India, we used the local firm C-Voter. They conducted the survey over the phone in 11 languages and dialects, and we wound up with a very large sample of 4,156 respondents. All these surveys were conducted in February and March 2023, and it took us a very long time to put everything in place to make sure all of that ran simultaneously. So our patience was rewarded because we were glad to be able to do that. The different modalities came from the different advice that we got from survey firms. So when we talked to Gallup Pakistan, they said face-to-face, door-to-door is going to be the best. When we talked to C-Voter in India, they said phone is going to be the best. For both firms, they said that's how we're going to be able to get you as close to a nationally representative sample as possible, each using their own method. For Gallup Pakistan, they based it on the 2017 census. So we deferred to the expertise of the people who were in country. And so obviously there are modality differences. I can't tell for sure if some of those modality differences had an impact on differences in survey findings. So that's a limitation to acknowledge. The survey instrument also contained demographic questions. It contained feeling thermometers. This is from Scott's work, and also with a rich history and political psychology work. And I'll describe what I mean by feeling thermometers as I get to that part in the findings. And a retribution index for the US and UK study only. We had to make hard choices. When you're conducting a survey verbally, you can't include as many questions. So the retribution index, we had to withdraw from the Pakistan and India companion study. Subjects were assigned to one of two response treatment conditions. So we have the manipulation of, you're assigned to either a conventional initial strike or a low yield nuclear initial strike. And then respondents were assigned to different response treatment conditions in which they either had a choice between conventional or low yield nuclear retaliatory responses, which included casualties. We exclude that group from the main findings because they were given only two choices, and we're much more interested in learning what we can from pooling across the next two sets of conditions. So the next two were a choice between conventional, low yield, or high yield responses, because that most closely approximates what a decision maker has in the real world. And in that response treatment condition, respondents were given information about casualties that they numbered the same for conventional and low yield attacks, but obviously higher for high yield. And again, we were trying to get as real world as possible, so this would have as much external validity as possible. And finally, a treatment condition where respondents were given those same three choices, but this time they also received vivid information about the effects of each type of weapon to humans, the environment, and infrastructure. So that helps us answer the question that we're posing about the revulsion and taboo aspect of nuclear non-use. We asked subjects which strike they would prefer, and then we asked an open-ended question: what is the most important reason you chose that response? None of this matters if respondents don't know what low-yield nuclear weapons are. When Gallup Pakistan ran the face-to-face pilot for us, they reported that there was a presumption that our presumption of general understanding was supported, meaning when they asked respondents if they understood what was meant by their phrasing, and both Gallup Pakistan and C Voter included adjectives that indicated that this was small and that this was battlefield or tactical use, to give them two hooks in. And I'll tell you why we did that. But they reported that, yes, people were understanding what they meant. Also, responses from both the Pakistan and India studies, responses to the open-ended questions, the way people talked about why they chose what they chose, they talked about it in ways that supported this presumption that they did understand what they were choosing. We also ran an internet pilot in the United States with 800 respondents. We asked, what do you think a low-yield nuclear weapon is? We asked 400 people that question. The other 400 got a different question. 79% of those answers demonstrated at least a basic, correct understanding of what a low-yield nuclear weapon is. And those answers were more likely to emphasize the size or scope of the effects of the weapon. We asked the other 400, what do you think a tactical nuclear weapon is? 2/3 of those answers demonstrated at least a basic understanding, and they were more likely to emphasize battlefield purpose or sophisticated or smart technology. And so our solution was, let's call it both those things, and we'll try to capture as much understanding as possible, especially in the response treatment where we're not giving as much information about what the weapons can do. Findings from the India and Pakistan study, I'll go over 4 main questions that we sought to answer. So first, do citizens exhibit restraint regarding nuclear use? And if the fire break is breached, will citizens be more likely to seek a tit-for-tat response? So this chart shows us how respondents answered the question when we asked them what response they would prefer. And on the left, we've got India, and on the right, we've got Pakistan. The left side of each of these graphs indicates how the respondents answered, what their preferences were when the initial strike from the enemy was conventional. And on the right, it is when the initial strike from the enemy was a low-yield nuclear strike. The red with the circle in the middle is for respondents who chose the low-yield option. The black with the diamond in the middle is the high-yield option. And the dark blue with the X means a conventional response. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of the preferred response type. So in the India, what are we seeing here? In the India graph, there was no statistically significant difference in terms of whether Pakistan in the hypothetical scenario had used nuclear weapons first or not. They were statistically equally likely to prefer an Indian nuclear strike against Pakistan. About 40% of the Indian respondents preferred a low-yield response, and high-yield response, either 28% or 32% based given for each condition. So belief in the fire break from the India sample at first glance then seems to be largely absent. In the Pakistan sample, at either the 95 or 99% confidence level, there were statistically significant differences between whether India used conventional weapons or low-yield nuclear weapons. For Pakistan, 37% preferred a low-yield response to India in the condition where India had not breached the fire break, but 45% preferred a low-yield response if India had breached the fire break. And 12% preferred a high-yield response, even if India hadn't breached the fire break yet. And then 31% after India has breached the fire break. So we have a near majority of Pakistanis who are willing to go nuclear first. And we have a majority who prefer a nuclear response. In India, we have a clear majority preferring nuclear first. So that's the first finding we're looking at. I want to jump down to the fourth. How do feelings about the rival citizens affect response preferences. So here's where I want to talk about the feeling thermometers. Because we know how entrenched the Indo-Pakistani rivalry is, all the way back to certainly partition in 1947, we asked citizens in each country how they felt about their co-nationals in terms of warmth or coolness, and how they felt about the rival citizens in terms of warmth or coolness. And then we subtracted, we got a difference between those two. So if there's a very, very big gap, then you are partial to your co-nationals, highly partial to your co-nationals compared to your rivals. If there's not much different and you feel equally toward both, then you're very low on that measure. So the way we scored this, and you'll see this in a minute on the chart, a score of -1 would actually mean you have warmer feelings toward your rival citizens than toward your own. A score of 0, equal. And what we're especially interested here in is the score at the high end of the scale, toward 1, where you have much warmer feelings toward your co-nationals than toward the outgroup, toward the enemy citizens. What I'm showing you here is a plot of the distribution of those scores. So remember, 1 means you strongly prefer your co-nationals to the rival. And you'll see that there is a normal distribution when we asked citizens. I'm focusing on the rival, but we also asked citizens, how do you feel about Americans and Brits and the Chinese and the Russians? How do you feel about all these folks? And then we averaged that all together. And we got a pretty normal distribution in terms of like when people, where that peaks and where that falls, how people feel about their rivals, but not for how they felt when we only looked at India, Pakistan, or Pakistan, India. And that's the bumpy yellow and red that gradually goes up and then shoots up toward the end. So we see from the distribution that it is, we have many more citizens in both countries with feeling strong preference for their own citizens compared to the rival citizens. It's a skewed distribution. And so what we did was we set a cut point where these distributions diverge at 0.7. And we said anything above 0.7 is high rivalry, high rival partiality. And then we plotted the marginal effect of that rival partiality on the preferred response type. So how does that affect whether you choose a low yield nuclear response to the enemy, a high yield response, or a conventional response? And what we found was, we've got India again on the left, Pakistan on the right. The black line is a high yield nuclear weapons response. Next is the blue slope, which is the non-nuclear response. And at the top, we've got the low yield nuclear response in red. And again, the y-axis is probability. What we find from looking at these charts is that rival partiality significantly and consistently impacts one's preferences for what strike one is going to choose. And so as you move right along the x-axis and you feel more warmly toward your citizens compared to how you feel about your rival citizens, we see that the willingness to choose high yield goes up, the willingness to choose conventional goes down. Low yield stays somewhat similar, interestingly. Last, how about vivid information? Does the vivid information about the effects of the weapons affect response preferences? So what we're looking at here is on the left, we have India, the right, Pakistan, left part of each chart, 3 choices without the vivid information. So non-nuclear, low yield, high yield. On the right side of each chart, you get the vivid information. And what we find is that there is a difference. For India, it's about 10 percentage points increasing their preference for a high yield response and decreasing the preference for the conventional response. If we thought about it this way, moving from vivid to not vivid, Pakistan has an 11-point swing. But the impact that I want to show you here. Oh, nope, that's okay. Let me go back. I'm not going to show it to you because it was too many slides, but I will tell it to you. The significance of this impact that I showed you a moment ago. Sorry, wrong way. There we go. The significance of essentially hating the rival disappears when vivid information is introduced. So for the highly partial respondents, when they were given vivid information about the effects of nuclear weapons, the effect of the high rivalry measure on their preferences disappeared. The vivid information mitigated it. So that's something that we want to study more. And in part, I keep doing the wrong button. In part, we're doing that by looking at their own explanations for their choices. We asked them, did they intend to escalate or de-escalate the situation or respond equally? And we asked them the most important reason why they chose the type of strike they chose. We coded those explanations for expressions of restraint or retribution. And when we analyzed those responses, we found there was a positive association between expressions of restraint and an intent to de-escalate, between expressions of retribution and an intent to escalate. And we saw that high rival partiality was associated positively with expressions of retribution and negatively with expressions of restraint. And what all of that did was confirm for us that citizens are thinking about these questions the way we were thinking about these questions, that they were not purely driven by hate, but they were based on calculation as well. So we found that citizen willingness to use nuclear weapons in this context was substantial. We found that the logic underlying their preferences was more complex than just being chalked up to hatred. We found that both retribution and restraint were underlying their choices. And we found that the vivid information had some moderating effect on preference for the most severe response, although that was really limited to those who were high on the rival compatriot partiality scale. I have about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to show you a key finding from the Russia-NATO hypothetical crisis from the US and UK study. And I will just blow through this slide very quickly because you're all familiar with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which took place February 24th, 2022, with the Russian nuclear threats and signaling that began that February, with the US perception of a serious potential low-yield threat from the Kremlin in September of 2022. We learned about it in October 2022. And with the Russian practice of low-level gray zone incursions into NATO territory that fall short of war, but that raise the risk and creep closer to where the fire break might or might not be. You can't see the fire break in some cases. So how do American and British citizens consider responding if there is a threat not to themselves, not to their vital interests of their own territory, the way it would be for India and Pakistan, but if the threat is to a NATO ally? Do citizens exhibit restraint? What happens if the fire break is breached? We've got the US sample on the left and the UK sample on the right. Both citizenries prefer a conventional strike to a nuclear strike. That was very clear. That is true even after Russia breaches the fire break with a hypothetical low-yield nuclear strike. And one potential explanation for this is the high salience of a Russian low-yield nuclear strike to both publics when we fielded this survey in February 2023. There was an enormous amount of attention, there had been for an entire year, about the possibility of a Russian low-yield nuclear strike and what that might mean and what a nuclear escalation might mean. And so for the public, this had filtered into public consciousness, and people were afraid. So we see nuclear restraint from this chart. Does vivid information affect response preferences? What these charts show us is really only in the US sample. There was a significant difference. On the right, you'll see that bar is lower, meaning any kind of nuclear response, if you provided Americans with a description of what nuclear weapons do compared to what conventional weapons do, they became less likely to choose a nuclear response. No difference in the UK sample. I don't know, I don't have the exact answer for this. We're looking through open-ended responses. Something that has struck me in looking through open-ended responses is that I see people in the UK sample saying things like, we're only a small island, a nuclear attack would destroy us. You don't hear Americans talk like that. The United States covers more than a continent. So that I would expect certainly geography has something to do with it, as well as the United States being on the other side of the ocean from the Baltics compared to the United Kingdom, which is not. And then the difference here that I want to highlight before I wrap up is going to be on the US side. So this chart shows us, if we move from the basic description to the vivid description, who is it in the US sample that's being restrained? It's not those who received the treatment condition where Russia struck with a conventional attack. It's those who are responding to a Russian initial low-yield nuclear strike. That's what's driving our significant finding for vivid information having an effect. It's the people in that group. So I find that interesting too. It's once the fire break has been breached, and in addition to the vivid information, that I see movement from a US response. So I can talk about retribution in the Q&A if we want to do that, but I want to wrap up to have time for questions. So if conventional conflict escalates, belief in the fire break should prevent fire break breach. But we have mixed findings out of these companion studies for whether there is belief in a fire break among citizens. And citizens might act as a constraint. They might act as a goad. And I think that we can conclude that low-yield nuclear weapons, based on responses in this study, do appear to have a different effect on how people are calculating about responses. It does seem to have an effect regarding costliness. It may have an effect, although this would be harder to tease out directly from these findings, but it may have an effect on credibility. And it appears to have an effect on activating, we could say, norms in some cases, under some conditions. That's a narrower finding. And especially in an environment today where norms are being contested, might low-yield nuclear use be appropriate? Should India reject its no first use doctrine? Does that mean what they say it means anyway? I think these questions matter in particular because they are so grounded in belief and perception. And so I will end it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you for the very thought-provoking talk. You can sit if you want it, or you can stand.
Sounds great.
To you. We're going to open up for Q&A. So there are a couple of rules following the CSEC tradition. I'm going to give the first few questions to our fellows and our students, then we'll open up for everybody. 1 finger for questions, 2 finger for follow-up. Please make sure that these are in-depth questions. And please introduce yourself before you pose your questions, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask you the very first questions. So this is a very, very interesting results. I have a questions about, I think in most of the cases you talked about retaliations, but would the results change pretty dramatically if you post first use questions? Like would you use it for the first time, the first use? And the other question that I had, if I remember correctly, it seems like the nuclear restraint is a little bit higher for the US-UK case. Is that because the scenario they were posing is inherently different, or is that because of non-use norms that's different? Thanks.
Thank you. So it's a great question. I would hesitate to speculate too much on what the answer would be. I would want to ask people. I would want to run the study to find out what if instead of this is a retaliation scenario, what if instead we were posing a scenario of there's something to be gained, like out of when I was paging through Kaplan's The Bomb and read about the Obama administration war games. And I was surprised by the discussion, and I was surprised by learning that there were a number of officials in both rooms that were advocating a tit for tat low yield response. It wasn't what I was necessarily expecting. And so that was really the scenario I wanted to plug into. But I think that would be a worthwhile study. On the second one, why is restraint different and higher? Why is there more restraint in the US and UK study? I think there could be a lot of potential. About how to what kind of constraints they might be on their leaders. So I really wanted to have a big kind of studies. Having said that, I can speculate a little, and I'm sure you can too. Why does the restraint look so different? I think in large part is going to be, I think it's going to be several things. I think it's in large part, it's going to be that for American and British publics, if one tells them there's been a Russian attack on Latvia, are they going to see that as a vital interest? Even if you say, but Latvia is a NATO member, are they going to see that as a vital interest? At the court, I don't think so. Versus if one tells Indian and Pakistani citizens, your bitter rival has yet again launched another attack against your country, and perhaps this will be the final one. The stakes are so very different. So I think there could be a lot of things going on. To me, that's probably at the core.
Go with Kevin.
Thank you, Sophie. This has been a wonderful talk.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I was going to do it. I'm so sorry. I'm Kevin Bustamante. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSEC. This is a great talk. Just on this point regarding potentially the differences, there's been two pieces over the last year, one by Adam Mallon, International Security, regarding conventional deterrence against nuclear use, but in Russia. And so for me, I wonder if that's part of the explanation here, which is like the United States doesn't need to go use low-yield nuclear weapons. Like they can deter Russia even with conventional forces. And so like I wonder, I mean, I don't know how much the public already knows this, but I wonder if that's one possibility for an answer. And the other thing, well, and that's it.
Did you want to?
No.
Right, that was the two-finger. No, I think that is a great suggestion. I do think, I mean, maybe if this study were conducted again right now, I don't know if it would apply as much, although maybe it would. But I think the timing of the study being just a few months after the fall of 2022, when Americans were paying attention to the threat of tactical nuclear use from Vladimir Putin, and the response from the United States was a conventional deterrent response. All of that signaling, and this was everyone in the administration was in lockstep, the same message. We would not, don't you dare do this. If you do, we will not respond in kind, but we will conduct a massive multinational conventional response, the likes of which you have never seen, and this and that and the other. So I think that as much as the US or British public would know about that as an option, I think that's exactly the time when they would have been thinking about it and would have been aware that that is an option in deterring a nuclear threat. So I think that's a really interesting suggestion that possibly that can explain if respondents are saying, but we don't need it. Our conventional capabilities are so great.
Yeah. Emily?
Hi, Emily Tallow, earlier postdoc here. Thank you. So really exciting study. I wanted to ask a little bit about what was the information given to the Indian and Pakistanis about the setting for these strikes to occur? Did you provide context for what precipitated this crisis okay.
Yes, go ahead. Keep asking. I'll pull up the slide.
Okay. And then my second question, was there any understanding in the open-ended responses did you see any understanding of the Indian and Pakistani nuclear doctrines in the open-ended responses? Because as you know, India has the no first use policy. So you're finding kind of contradicts what you would expect from the Indian side. But then it seems to me like the Pakistani side had more understanding of India's response to the threat of, we're not going to treat low yield tactical nuclear weapons as tactical nuclear weapons. We're going to treat it as a nuclear strike, and we will strike overwhelmingly. So I just was curious if you had thought about that at all.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I'll take the first one first, just so it's up here and we're reading it. So this is the language for the Pakistan and India scenario. So this is what's given to Pakistani respondents. Imagine India's army has attacked a Pakistani military base in Kashmir. So first, the fight is in Kashmir. It's in the disputed territory. And so again, we're trying to be real world and say what has happened in the past? What do people fear is likely to happen again? India claims Kashmir is part of India. Pakistan's army responds by fighting back. Fight is going better for Pakistan than India thought it would. So again, when we give this to the other country, we're just swapping. It's the same language. We're just swapping the country names. As a result, India launches a low-yield tactical nuclear bomb at a Pakistani military base in rural Punjab. We say what the death count is. And we say it is members of the Air Force and civilians living nearby. And then this is going to be too much. This is just going to be a lot. But this is if you want to see what the vivid information is that the third response treatment group gets, you can just read the last sentence or two for each of these. So what if you want to use conventional bombs? This is what that airstrike will do. Explosions, fires, destroy or damage most buildings on the base. What if you choose low yield nuclear? That will cause a fireball. It will destroy the base. It will destroy or damage most buildings in the town next to the base. It will spread radiation to the town. And so again, this is Alex Wallerstein's nuke map, which I'm so grateful for. It's such a wonderful tool. And then the final one, the high yield strike, it will destroy everything on the base, the fireball, destroy or damage all buildings in the town next to the base. People living there will be severely burned. Buildings in other towns nearby will also be damaged. Radiation will spread to many towns and cities. So just that level. So we're not showing images, we're not showing videos, but just the increasing amount of all of these things are going to cause damage. But there is a material difference that I'm signaling between conventional and the nuclear. So, and that might be the more important one. So that's the information they received about the setting. And I know you might have a follow-up, but I know we have to take turns. And then your question about doctrines. So interestingly, in the open-ended responses, I think out of the 4,100 plus respondents from India, 8 mentioned no first use. Because every time I got there, I was like, oh my gosh, someone mentioned no first use. This is incredible. And I was so excited about it, but it only happened 8 times. So, but that's impressive, right? That there are people in any country who know that much, who would be able to be that specific about a matter of doctrine. I thought that was fascinating, but very little. But people were echoing the ideas behind no first use in their open-ended responses when they were describing why they had chosen a restrained approach. When you mentioned that Pakistanis seem to have maybe more understanding of the risk of low yield nuclear weapons or more understanding of the threat posed by India. That seemed clear to us from the findings, and we talk about this a little bit in the paper. In fact, when we conducted an attention check, we conducted a manipulation check. The interviewers asked respondents, so what was the initial strike from the enemy? Do you remember? And those who failed the check were different types in Pakistan and India in this sense. Indians seemed to assume that the strike from Pakistan was non-nuclear. If they were incorrect on that side. It was like, no, this was a nuclear strike. And they misremembered that it was not a nuclear strike. It was the opposite for Pakistan. Those who failed the attention check failed it in the direction of it had been a conventional Indian strike, but they assumed it was a nuclear strike. And so that told us something, and we discussed it in the paper, about just what the baseline assumptions are in each state for how each state might behave in the conflict in the first place. And so I think there is something interesting there about, just what you're assuming the other state is likely to do.
If I can just add on the vignette part, I think it's interesting that you did not include the trigger for the crisis being a terror attack or something like that, because I think that might even drive up the Indian responses even more. And that's, as you know, like the most likely scenario when this would happen. But it's also possible that they would be like in their mind thinking, okay, well, obviously India's been attacked, otherwise we would not be attacking. That might already be part of the underlying assumption. I'm not sure if you found that at all, but
I couldn't flip it.
Right,
I felt it wouldn't be believable to tell Pakistan that it was an Indian terror attack in Kashmir.
It might just be like in their assumptions of like what's going on. But
absolutely, yep.
We have Sitara, X, Indrek, and Dipen, and then we'll move on to Thomas Scott. Let's go with Sitara.
Thank you, Sitara Noor, postdoctoral fellow here. Very fascinating talk. I think I would start with the discussion that often goes around in Pakistani and Indian circle, for that matter as well, with regards to the tactical nuclear weapons or low yield nuclear weapons, because there is often this point that is being raised that we need to see it differently, how it is being seen in the Western literature, because in India-Pakistan geographical connotation, there is no such thing as tactical. Any nuclear use would be strategic in nature because of the border, the closeness of the border, and the population on the borders on the both sides. So that's one point that often raised in the discussion. And also, I wonder if because the Indian response coming from in the responding with the low yield nuclear weapons, that technically contradicts their official nuclear doctrine, which is of a massive retaliation to any use anywhere in the world or nuclear forces, be it nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. So India basically dilutes a lot when we talk about their response to, and that adds from the Pakistani side, that adds to where you very nicely discussed about the credibility of the response. So that adds to Pakistan's calculation, how credible they think India's response would be. Having said that, I would wonder in terms of, or did you encounter that the respondents, how knowledgeable were they in reality about what they were looking at? Because in general, the discussions, broad understanding, of course, exists among the masses, but I really doubt if there was clarity of what they were addressing or what they were responding to in terms of differentiating between the tactical strategic weapons or the response options that are there. Because, the discussion in India, Pakistan among the masses about use of nuclear weapons is a bit desanitized in the sense that it often comes into, okay, we would use it because that's what we have. If India responds, we have this option. So I was just wondering, did you find out that, was that an impediment in finding the right answers, the level of understanding of the masses, what they were responding to in terms of, do they have clear understanding, which I doubt was there because, how I see or how in my discussion with common people, unless they were experts from the nuclear community.
Of course. So, and I will just, let's see, I'll just put up, this was how each survey firm translated the terms into, we have Urdu and Hindi here, we don't have the other dialects, but it was that's how they were translating it when you read it back into English. So I agree. There's no way. So your point about India's massive retaliation doctrine is so well taken, and there's no way that I would ever expect any citizen anywhere in the world to have that kind of understanding of what their government's doctrine, nuclear doctrine is, and what their planned responses are. So I assume that citizens I'm asking don't know that maybe some of them have heard of no first use, as this is also taken, as you know, as a moral principle, but they wouldn't know technicalities. It seemed from the open-ended responses that many respondents, and I don't want to give numbers because I don't have them top of mind, had an appreciation and understanding for the difference between like the low blast or the lightweight versus the big. But a lot, and I don't want to, a substantial number, and I can't remember right now, and I don't think I have the slide, maybe 1 in 5 respondents, let's say, don't hold me to that, said, I don't know, or I don't understand what you're asking me. So there is in that sense then a lot of noise in the findings, and why I'm so appreciative for the very large samples, because that allows me to still draw conclusions. But there were many, many more people in the India and Pakistan samples than in the US and UK samples that essentially said, I'm throwing up my hands, I don't understand what you're asking me. And that makes a lot of sense. Go to X.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I'm X and postdoctoral fellow at CSAC as well. My question is kind of more theoretical on what do you think the underlying phenomenon you are capturing in the study? Because one possibility is to kind of put it in a theoretical way, what is a low yield weapon is sort of a social construct, right? As you point out at the very start of the talk, whether a 100,000 ton weapon is low yield compared to a 5 megaton weapon, and potentially what kind of response people have on the low yield weapon use is conditional on how elites frame these decisions and emerging norm that they try to shape to the public, right? So this question is sort of inspired by the data you show on the difference between India and Pakistan. Potential one explanation is basically they have talked about this is a new norm they want to engage in shaping, and that's why the citizens also have this differentiation, but that's not the case in India.
I think that's a really great point. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to investigate some of these questions, is because I do observe, like you are, there is norm contestation happening regarding lower yield nuclear weapons. And I think how elites frame it is really important. And I think that the way the Biden administration framed it in the context of 2022 and then into 2023 was very much, this is a threshold that one does not cross at any level at all. It will change the world. It will destroy the world order that we've had since 1945. This is completely unacceptable. So that's then a reiterating of this fire break. But both the accuracy and low yield revolutions mean that this has, I think, accelerated just norm contestation generally and questions about the nuclear taboo. And so I think that elite framing is very important, and that a lot of this is very much top down, and then trying to understand what citizens think about it is coming at it ground up. Tannenwald argues the taboo is grounded in large part in terms of acceptance of the taboo, and that means even down to the citizen level. But I think you're making a really good point. Indrek.
Thank you. Indrek Sarap, I'm a visiting scholar from Estonia, and I do not know anything about nuclear weapons, neither Asia. I think I have a follow-up question to that, and to do with framing. You started with a quote from General Mattis saying that it is all about every nuclear use is strategic, and you continue it to explain the concept of fire breaks. If it would be framed a little bit differently, not tactical nuclear weapons versus strategic nuclear weapons, but it would be framed conventional forces and their balance of power with tactical nuclear weapons and keeping the strategic nuclear weapons separate. Do you think that would change the results of the survey?
That's interesting. If I established those are two categories, and I said you can either have conventional forces with these tactical nuclear weapons, or you have the option over here of the higher yield of the strategic weapons. So you would to force a choice essentially between.
I would argue that this is the way, for instance, in Russia, in their doctrine, how they are looking at it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, and much has been made of this Russian doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. Go ahead. Yeah, you have a thought.
I think this escalate to de-escalate is something different. It is to do with strategic level.
Yes.
And low yield nuclear weapon is just a tool to do that. But in the Russian doctrine, the role that they see their tactical nuclear weapon for is to balance their vulnerability in conventional forces. At least this has been after the end of the Cold War.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting and important point. And I think that we get that glimpse into that happening in practice when we get the US intelligence community saying in the fall of 2022, it's a coin flip, it's 50-50 whether Putin's actually going to authorize the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield because Russia he perceives Russia is about to lose the war. And so that idea that, yes, he would be willing to do it. This is not a barrier to him the way it might be a barrier in the United States, a conceptual barrier. I think that is important because you don't see Putin, you don't see the intelligence community saying Putin is thinking about delivering strategic nuclear weapons to Washington, D.C. Like, that's not what's happening. It's that, is he viewing tactical nuclear weapons as appropriate and as part of conventional war fighting because it is small enough that it might not provoke the apocalyptic retaliation and it might be worth the cost to him. I think his thinking about it was revealed to be different from what like the traditional theory would say, the theory of the fire break would say. He should never have thought of that in the first place, but we have evidence that apparently he did. So I think it's a very fair point that these deterrence environments and these nuclear strategic environments appear to be different in different countries to some extent.
We only have 3 minutes left and at least 4 people online. So I'm just gonna group the questions together if that's okay. To keep the Q&A a little bit shorter, that would be fantastic. So I have Dipin and Tom.
Hi, I'm Dipin. I'm a postdoctoral, visiting fellow here. I'm not sure what it's called. Really fascinating talk. I just have a quick question about the survey. And I was wondering whether you were able to get at the perceptions of the probability of victory among respondents. And is that shaping a response in some way? And the reason that I ask is kind of related to the discussion we were just having, because at least in India, true or not, there's a huge superiority narrative, right? That we are going to come out of any war victorious. So this might be, the results that we see in India might be a result of leaders goading citizens into going all out in war instead of citizens goading leaders into, having some sort of response. So if you were able to get at that in the survey in terms of whether it's conditioning responses, that'd be fascinating to see.
Let's take one more question from Tom and then you can.
So I just wanted to ask you quickly on this dichotomy between retribution and restraint. So on the retribution side of that dichotomy, there's potentially quite a lot of complexity in terms of different ways in which we think about a punitive response. So it could be punitive in a consequentialist form, either as a reprisal or a deterrent act, which themselves are somewhat distinct, but where it's really about what you think is going to be effective in terms of reducing the likelihood of escalation. Or it could be punitive in a pure retributive sense, but that could itself be internally restrained because retribution is in principle restrained to what's proportionate in response to the adversary. Or it could be vengeful, which would not necessarily be restrained at all, but would still be punitive. And both the retributive and vengeful forms are more backward looking. They're not really about what's going to follow from this at all. It's more about what's adequate response to what's already happened. And so all of those could be concepts on the retribution side of your dichotomy. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about whether you thought there was any way of understanding that differentiation through the data that you've elicited.
Great. I'll try to be very concise. No, on the victory question, because I didn't give any military utility because I was so constrained by the verbal giving of the surveys. I could not ask that question, and I wish I could have, because it's important, and we know from other studies that it does also shape attitudes about what to respond with. And I have a paper from 2024 that examines exactly what you're asking me about these backward-looking and forward-looking types of retribution. Are you doing it to deter future bad behavior, or are you doing it on principle? And I do have, from the open-ended responses, I did code for different types of expressions of retribution, but I have not yet had a chance to analyze that part of it. So stay tuned is the answer.
So we are at times, and I hugely apologize to those that we didn't get to answer, but hopefully you can stay for a couple more minutes after the webinar so we can answer some of the questions. But please join me in thanking